We'll take the speakers in the order they're listed, but before we start, I just want to say a little word about this decline. I took my first course in Middle Eastern history in 1959, and the first I heard of decline, the first discussion of it, had nothing to do with the Ottoman Empire or with Islam. It had to do with Arabic literature. And the received opinion that we had at that time was that decline is what happens after Mutanabbi. That you don't have any great poets after that, and therefore there's not a whole lot of point studying very much after that, because Arabic literature is the core of everything. And in point of fact, at that time in Middle Eastern studies, classical Arabic literature and classical Arabic texts were so dominant that the idea that there would be a whole room full of people specializing in Turkish and Persian would have seemed to be an absurdity, much less that so many of them would actually be Turks and Persians, because it was a lily-white profession in those days.
Or at least look like them.
And look like them, yes. When I took first year Persian at Harvard in 1962, the class had 2 people in it, and in second year Persian that had declined to 1 person because Arabic was everything. So I'm happy my colleague George Saliba has shown up so that we have another Arab in the room, but the fact of the matter is that long before Bernard Lewis and Gustav von Grunebaum wrote about decline, both of them Arabists primarily, decline was already thought of in a completely different context. So I'm adapting to the world as it has evolved, but it has evolved in a very unexpected way.
Okay.
So I'd like to...
Well, first of all, thank you so much. I think if I look over the list of conference participants, at least half of the people are people who directly contributed to my graduate education, either as cohort members or professors, and the other half are people who I aspired to be like when I was in graduate school. So it's very exciting to be here. I think that my presentation is a good segue between the last panel and the presentations of my colleagues, because I'm going to be dealing with sort of 2 touchstones of 2 big narratives in world history. One would be the narrative of Islamic civilization, and the other would be the narrative of Western civilization. So the first one is the Caliphate. The Caliphate is when we talk about the paradigm of golden age and decline in the history of Islamic civilization. It's really critical because in that traditional narrative, the Caliphate is the time of the golden age, right? It's this time when you have this strong empire and there's all kinds of wonderful things happening there, and then it starts to disintegrate, and that's when things start going wrong, and then eventually the Mongols come and then they just extinguish it, and then that's the end, right? So that's part of it. And then later on, this funny thing happens where the Ottoman Sultanate becomes associated with the Caliphate for reasons that are not necessarily always totally clear. And
yes, I'm sorry, I apologize.
you guys can't hear me?
Just double check. I apologize for the inconvenience.
How am I? Okay, great. Okay. So then this weird thing happens that at some point the Ottoman Sultan becomes associated with the Caliphate. And this is something that's still very strong. I mean, I teach a class in Ottoman history at the University of Minnesota. I usually have about 80 or 90 students. It's a big school. And we have a lot of Muslims in Minnesota, believe it or not. And when I go around the room the first day and I ask people why they're taking the class, one of the answers that always comes up is because the Ottomans were the last caliphs of Islam. This is very much in people's mind. Now the problem is, historians don't really agree about how it is that the Ottoman Sultan came to be associated with the Caliphate. The traditional explanation is that when Sultan Selim the Grim conquered Egypt in 1517, he inherited the title of Caliph from the last Abbasid shadow caliph in Cairo, along with the title of Defender of the Holy Cities from the Mamluk Sultan. The problem is that there isn't a lot of evidence that people took those titles particularly seriously at the time. And even more importantly, there isn't a lot of evidence that the Ottomans took those titles particularly seriously at the time. Right after Selim conquered Egypt, he wrote a bunch of letters to a bunch of people telling him how wonderful it was that he had conquered Egypt, and he didn't really emphasize the fact that he was now caliph. And so as a result, there's this sometimes very nasty debate between people who on one extreme would like to draw a direct line between the very earliest caliphs up to the Ottoman Sultanate and all the way to the 20th century. And on the other hand, there are people who would like to argue that it's a construct of modernity, that this idea of an Ottoman caliphate is something that was invented in the 19th century and it has sort of no basis in history before that time. Okay? So that's one problem. So let's put that problem over here. Now the second problem that we have relates to the history of Western civilization, and this is the age of exploration. And the age of exploration is really, it's the critical linchpin of the whole narrative of Western civilization, because this is the moment in which Western history becomes world history, right? Europeans behold the world, and then they explore the world, and then they conquer the world, and when they conquer the world, they bring their own systems of thought and their legal system and their economic system, and they export it to the rest of the world, and then everybody then becomes Western. So the age of exploration is the place where this all comes together. And I would argue that for world historians, this continues to be a problem, because world history is really kind of conceptualized as a way of explaining the history of the world in a from a non-Eurocentric vantage point. But when we get to the age of exploration, it kind of all breaks down. There's no way to get away from the fact this is Europeans that are playing this critical role in bringing the world together. Okay? So these are the two problems that we have. We have the problem of the caliphate and the narrative of Islamic civilization, and then we have the problem of the age of exploration and the narrative of Western civilization. And what I'd like to suggest is that there's a way that we can bring them together in a productive and useful way. So what you're looking at here, this is an example of I think it really captures the spirit of the age of exploration. This is a commemorative medallion that was coined for Philip II of Spain at the unification of the realms of Portugal and Spain, which brought the two hemispheres of the world together under his rule. There's a globe there, and then the caption reads, "Non sufficit orbis." The world is not enough. Most of my students seem to think that this is a James Bond movie, but it actually comes from Philip II. And I think what you see here is the sort of the inexorable, insatiable drive behind the age of exploration, right? So what you have is you have really three components to what's going on. First, you have a new conceptualization of the world. There's a recognition of the world as a globe, as a finite space. Once you have the recognition of the globe as a finite space, it becomes itself a legitimate object of political ambition. It actually becomes possible to think about conquering the world. And that really changes what it means to have universal sovereignty. Before this, universal sovereignty, of course everyone has universal sovereignty, but it's something that doesn't have limits. Now all of a sudden, the globe is finite. So people start to develop new ideologies of empire that are specifically directed towards this project of controlling the globe politically. And then this actually leads to political agency. Once you have this new framework of understanding and this new ideology, it allows people to become political agents and actually go and conquer the world. An interesting thing is that the ideas and the understanding come first, and the ideology precedes the action. So the ideology is enabling agency, okay? The question is this something that is only happening amongst Europeans, or is it something that we can understand a bit more broadly? And this is the way that I would like to help reconceptualize this whole process. So you have this famous episode, the Treaty of Tordesillas. The kings of Portugal and Spain, Columbus has just returned from America. The kings of Portugal and Spain sign this agreement where they divide the world in half. They draw a line down the middle of the world. Portugal gets the eastern half, Spain gets the western half, and they divide sovereignty between the two of them. So Portugal has sovereignty over the entire eastern Mediterranean. Okay? Now what they do at this point is they go to the Indian Ocean. Eastern Hemisphere. Sorry, no Mediterranean. I've got confused by Terry Burke. They go to the Indian Ocean, and the way that they actually enact this claim to sovereignty over the entire hemisphere is by, do I have a little pointer? No. If I had a pointer, I would be pointing to the area right around the mouth to the Red Sea. They try to prevent Muslims from traveling to and from the Red Sea. This is how they express their sovereignty over the entire Eastern Hemisphere. That's because these are important trade routes, but they are also the Hajj. This is the Hajj route, right? And so what this means is that for the first time in history, there's actually a non-Muslim maritime power in the Indian Ocean that is making it impossible for Muslims to travel from wherever they happen to live in the world by sea to Mecca and Medina. And so what happens is you have a response to this ideology. This is a process I like to call the dialectic of the universal sovereign, okay? Because it's a dialectic in the most basic sense of an unstable relationship of reaction and counter-reaction that's inherently productive. It's leading from one step to the next. You can't go back. It's progressive, okay? So people in the Indian Ocean start casting around for some way to organize themselves in order to defend themselves from what the Portuguese are doing. And they start to play around with this idea of the caliph. They start saying, well, maybe we used to have this thing called a caliph. Maybe there should be someone called a caliph who's responsible for keeping us safe. Maybe the person who controls Mecca and Medina and Egypt should be the person who's the caliph. There's this person who's controlling Egypt now, and there's someone there called the caliph, and the person who controls Egypt has this title, defender of the holy cities. Maybe that person should be responsible for protecting our interests. Maybe that's the way that we can articulate a response to this Portuguese claim to being sovereigns over all of the Indian Ocean. Okay? Now, at this point, the Ottomans conquer Egypt. And they may not even have known that they were inheriting these titles. But for the people that lived out in the world, this was real. And so people started to talk about this idea of the caliphate and protector of the holy cities in the context of the Ottomans. Oh, the Ottomans conquered Egypt. Now the Sultan is protector of the two cities. Sultan is caliph. The Sultan has a responsibility to defend our interests. This is quite fascinating because on the one hand, it's a big challenge from the Ottoman perspective. Because if you accept the principle that as caliph, the Ottoman Sultan is responsible for protecting the well-being of Muslims everywhere, then if they can't do it, their legitimacy can be called into question. So theoretically, the Sultan could be diminished or humiliated by his inability to defend people who live thousands of miles outside of the territory he controls in places that he may not even have any idea exist. Okay? This is a big problem. On the other hand, if he does at least make an effort to try to protect the interests of these people, then this is a huge opportunity, because there's this ideology out there, ready-made, which allows him to turn all of those people into a constituency that he can use to mobilize resources and mobilize manpower to an extent that otherwise would be impossible. So I don't really have, this is some Ottomans contemplating the globe. This is just for fun. But if I had an hour to tell you about my book, I would go into much more detail, but I wanted to show you a couple of maps to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. So what I try to do is sort of lay out the process by which the Ottomans realize the problem presented by this dialectic of universal sovereignty on the one hand, and on the other hand, develop strategies for actually turning it into an advantage. And by the 1560s, I argue that they become actually quite adept at using this to their advantage and building this huge, soft empire in the Indian Ocean. So what you're looking at here, this is a map that's kind of showing you the extent of Ottoman diplomatic involvement with various Muslim constituencies in the world beyond their borders. So the most important thing is these little stars and crescents are representing communities where the Ottoman Sultan's name is being read in the khutbah of the Friday sermons. And you can see it follows the main trade and pilgrimage routes across the Indian Ocean, and according to one Ottoman account, even into China. Okay? And the next map, this is giving you an idea of the activity that is associated with this network of the caliphate. Okay, so the battle stars are, it's a bit complicated, I don't want to get into all the details, but the battle stars are places where there actually is an encounter between some Portuguese and some local Muslims and some kind of a support or coordination from the Ottoman state. Okay, so when you look at that, this is really totally unprecedented. Okay, there's no kind of military and political coordination across this kind of a geographic scope before the 16th century of any kind. This is really something new. And what I want to emphasize here is that, in this old narrative that we have of the rise of the West and then Golden Age in decline, it's presented as if it's a zero-sum game, right? The rise of the West equals modernity equals everybody else who is not Western is actually losing out. But what I'm suggesting here is that this massive hemispheric imperial project is something that's only possible because there are Portuguese on the other side that have a rival ideological claim that is supporting what the Ottomans are trying to do. You have to have a kind of a foil to push against. Okay? And in fact, sort of the conclusion is that ultimately the Portuguese fail. The Ottomans are the ones that win, and they force the Portuguese to stop trying to prevent the flow of trade. But then once they do that, that deprives the Ottomans of the ideological leverage and makes their own imperial project unsustainable. So you really need to understand these things as a relationship rather than as a zero-sum game. This is kind of the basic point. Now, the last thing I want to say is that, again, the concept of the dialectic is useful because this has a life of its own even after the Ottomans and the Portuguese are no longer in the picture at all. As the Ottomans are developing these rival claims to universal sovereignty, there are other rival Muslim powers that are developing their own new ideological elaborations of universal rulership within this new finite global context. And eventually, those bump up against each other when the Ottomans are not even in the picture anymore. So what you're looking at here, this is quite a famous Mughal painting from the 17th century. It's showing you Jahangir, he's come up a couple of times before, and Shah Abbas of Iran. The two of them have just signed a peace treaty. They're embracing, but then you can see what they're standing on is very obviously a European-style globe. And I think this is just a great illustration of the way in which in the early modern period, what you see is a new idea of the globe as a finite space, as a legitimate object of political ambition, but also something that serves as a backdrop for even very local kinds of political competition. And I think that this is, it's really a key concept, because if you'll go just a little bit farther with me, once you start looking for things like this, you will find them all over the place. And there's a very direct line between this and what a lot of people would consider the end game of the history of modernity, which is the modern nation state, right? When you get to the modern nation state, what you're dealing with is a world in which every place is divided up into these mutually exclusive and yet theoretically equivalent nation states that in their totality define human political existence. Correct? And how we got to that point is one of the basic questions that historians ask. And I guess what I'd like to leave you with is the idea that if we really want to understand how we got to that place, not just to understand the history of Islam, but if we really want to understand the history of the world, we need, first of all, to engage much more seriously with the idea of the early modern as a world historical concept. And second, we need to engage with the concept of early modernity as something that is produced precisely out of the interaction between Europeans and Muslims and other people that lead us from this to the world that we live in today. So I think I've said enough. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My work, first of all, thank you for Jamil and the organizers, and thank you, Jamil, to include me to the group of Meatbusters. And I was given the task to talk about military technology and warfare, and how warfare studies and Ottomanists who participated in warfare studies contributed to this debate and criticizing the decline paradigm. In the 1980s and 1990s, one of the major paradigm in warfare studies was the military revolution debate. And Geoffrey Parker, who has a book about the grand strategy of Philip II, and has this medallion, I think, there. And he has another book with the same title, The Word Is Not Enough, I think, which is a collected essays. So he is very, very influential in warfare studies. He started as a critical, skeptical scholar of the military revolution debate, that theory that goes back to the 1950s. But then by 1988, he wrote a book, Military Revolution, Technological Innovation and the Rise of the West. And its most ambitious edition, this whole theory of military revolution tries to explain everything from the rise of absolute states to the rise of the West and the decline of the rest. When reading these European studies, first of all, I was struck that the Ottomans, who were one of the strongest military powers in the 16th, 17th centuries, they were relegated into the background. And I encountered several major theories with regard to Ottoman military power and prowess, and these are the followings. The so-called Islamic conservatism and military despotism, which militated against borrowing of Western techniques and against native inventiveness. Continuous dependence on Western technology and know-how in the form of European cannon fenders and technicians. For Ottoman technicians allegedly lacked the necessary knowledge to produce good quality weapons. Technological inferiority in spite of borrowings and the employment of foreign technicians, the lack of property law, and security of property, which made it safe in Western Europe to invest substantial capital in mining technology and to perfect ore mining and hence the quality of cannons, insufficient manufacturing capacity, resulting in Ottoman dependence on European imports. Obviously, there are major problems with these theses, which are in the major European textbooks by now. First, they are monocausal and try to explain complex processes such as the adoption and adaptation of weapons technologies with a single factor, usually Islam, and neglecting other more important reasons such as social and economic context. Second, they afford science and technology a much greater role than it actually played in military affairs before the industrialization of warfare. I usually tell my students that it's very nice to talk about treatises on ballistics in the 16th and 17th centuries, Newton's firing tables, but it didn't matter until we go to the industrialized warfare when weapons are standardized. And there was no major revolution in weapons technology until the late 19th century. I sometimes tell my students until the nuclear weapons. So it didn't matter, and what mattered, it was quantity rather than quality until the late 19th century. So this whole technological inventiveness of the West is overemphasized. And third, and most importantly, these assumptions are based on selective and atypical evidence and have in recent years proved factually wrong and untenable in light of new research. So in my book and in my studies, I try to criticize these points, and I demonstrated that the Ottomans created the necessary organizational financial framework to ensure a prompt and efficient production and supply of ammunition and weaponry early in their history, that the ability of the Ottoman central and local authorities to adjust them according to the changing socio-economic conditions enabled the Ottomans to achieve self-sufficiency in armament production and to maintain it for centuries, indeed in certain sectors of the arms industry well into the 18th century. I also demonstrated that the reasons for the dominance of traditional non-gunpowder weapons in Muslim armies are manifold, but religion usually played a very modest role, if any at all, in delaying the introduction of firearms in certain Muslim polities. Historical evidence suggests that Muslim armies and states adjusted their weaponry and tactics to that of their enemies with relative ease, and did not hesitate to introduce new weapons and new technical formations when faced rivals equipped with those weapons. A comparative look at the history of technology diffusion demonstrates that the contribution of European technicians to the Ottoman military, arms industry, and weapons technology should not be exaggerated. Inviting and employing foreign technicians was the prime means throughout Europe to acquire new technology. The assistance of craftsmen from cultures that were considered to be on the cutting edge of technology at a certain point in time was inevitable for countries not yet familiar with that particular technology if they were to establish their indigenous arms industries. The Ottomans were no exception. Rather, they were very much part of this transfer of early modern weapons technology of the 15th and 16th centuries. What made the Ottoman case somewhat unique was its ideal place for technological diffusion. I tell my students that think about Istanbul, Constantinople, of the latter part in the 15th century and the 16th century as New York City today. Everyone wanted to go to Constantinople. Everyone was selling his expertise, and it was an ideal place where people could share knowledge. It was one of the major centers of espionage, of information gathering, of diplomacy. So when people say that the Ottomans became part of the European state system in the 18th century, I always smile. because Istanbul, after Venice probably and Rome, was, and Madrid, was one of the major center of international politics. Miners from the mining center of medieval Serbia, Bosnia, Greece, and Asia Minor brought their knowledge of metallurgy to Istanbul. Muslim blacksmiths added their knowledge of metalworking techniques of the Islamic East that produced the world-renowned Damascus blades. Istanbul, with its Turkish and Persian artisans and blacksmiths, Armenian and Greek miners and sappers, Bosnian, Serbian, Turkish, Italian, German, and later French, English, and Dutch gun founders and engineers, as well as with its Venetian, Dalmatian, and Greek shipwrights and sailors, proved to be an ideal environment for technological dialogue. There was no iron curtain in the Mediterranean or in the early modern world. I just simply don't understand how could serious historians state the opposite. So this is the 16th century, and this is one thing to question these Orientalist and Eurocentric biases, but there is another to offer something instead. What I try to do in the second part of my comments is to tell that maybe we should look at the military prowess and power of the Ottomans and the shift, because this is why I started, because I wanted to understand what happened, not what went wrong, but what happened to the Ottomans, because it's undeniable that by the 18th century, the Ottomans are defeated by the Habsburgs and mainly by the Russians. It changes the chronology a bit. Instead of accepting Carlo Maria Cipolle's chronology, who thinks that the divergence appeared right at the time of the conquest of Constantinople, because supposedly Ottomans were so mesmerized by these big, huge monster cannons that they continued to cast these big cannons, whereas Europe went into the more mobile cannons. This is not true, but of course this is based on European travelers who go to Istanbul, go to the Dardanelles. Baron de Thot, who was one of the earliest major best promoters, the guy didn't understand anything about cannon casting. When they asked the guy to help in cannon casting, he consulted the French encyclopedia. He was part of the Hussar Brigade in France. He had no, expertise in weapons technology at all. But, his book became a bestseller, and of course he describes this huge obsolete cannon which were on the Dardanelles, on the walls of a certain Ottoman castles. But of course, this is not the source you look at when you want to understand the composition of Ottoman artillery. You go to the archives, and you do have the books of the Ottoman Tophane, the Imperial Cannon Foundry, and you can compile what I did. It's very boring, but it's important. Tables, how many cannons, what type of cannons were cast, and you can even compare it to the European ones. And it turns out that it was almost the same. There was no difference. So then what happened by the end of the 18th century? And here I suggest that we should study, and I call the rise of the Eastern powers, which are the Ottoman Empire, the Habsburg Empire, and the Russian Empire. Hamish Scott has a book, The Rise of the Eastern Powers. Those are the traditional Eastern powers, Prussia, the Habsburgs, and the Ottomans. But I think the Ottomans were part of it, because what happens in the Habsburg case and in Muscovy in the 16th century is that they reformed their military partly in response to Ottoman military superiority and firepower superiority. They built castles, etc., etc. There are many parallels. Ivan Peresvetov, for instance, recommended his monarch to copy the Ottomans, and historians debate whether the service cavalry, the Pomeshche cavalry, was influenced by the Ottomans or not, and the Sterzi, whether they were influenced by the Janissaries. It doesn't matter, but what matters that both Muscovy and the Habsburgs reacted to to Ottoman, and in the case of Muscovy, mainly to Tatar, challenges. And this is the 16th and part of the 17th century. Both Muscovy and the Ottomans had their time of troubles, the Gelar revolts and the time of troubles in Muscovy, and both empires were exposed to new type Western military technologies, the Ottomans in the Hungarian frontier, in the case of Muscovy, fighting against the Swedes and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealths. But the responses they gave were very different. The Muscovites went into toward a more centralized military. Eventually, they would discard the Pomeschi cavalry. The Timarli cavalry declined in the Ottoman case as well. But in Muscovy, they go for the so-called new model army, the new formations, which were Western-type formations. What happens in the Ottoman Empire, though, there is the so-called decentralization. I'm not going to recap Halilinajic's seminal article and the literature that goes after that, but there is a decentralization, which means that the center's access to resources is much more limited. Whereas in the middle of the 16th century, the center controlled almost 60% of tax revenues. By the 1660s, it dropped to 24%. There's no major population boom in the Ottoman Empire, whereas Russia expanded in terms of population. They go for conscription, and they would, whereas in the 16th century, the two empires' capability to mobilize armies, these are comparable, but by the mid-18th century, the Russians, by the time we can use Russia, could have a military potential which was 3 times what the Ottomans were able to mobilize. And it goes for, if you compare the revenues, for instance. So the major divergence, I think, is not until the 18th century. In the mid-18th century, 1740s, the revenues of the two empires are comparable if you convert it into tons of silver. But by the 80s, the 1780s, Russia's revenues are 7-fold of the Ottoman Empire, and by 1795, 10-fold, if I convert the ruble and the akçe silver content correctly. It's not that easy. In fact, Şevket Pamuk has an article in the Journal of Economic History, and his graph shows less discrepancy than my calculations. So I am arguing what is happening in this whole realm. There are responses to challenges, but the responses would lead to different results. In the case of Russia, Russia would evolve into an absolutist state, although European historians don't anymore use the absolutist. Now they use fiscal military state. Hamish Scott argues that it was mainly military fiscal than fiscal military state. Anyway, so it's a complicated. But the Ottomans go to devolution of power. And I like what Baki suggests, that you can perceive this Ottoman Empire as a limited monarchy, in which the central's access to resources is limited. So it led to 2 different types of states, which eventually led to different military capabilities and power. So what happens, whereas the Muscovites reformed along the western lines, since the Timarli Sipahi army declines, the Sultan needed to rely on an available source, and these are the ayans. So I would suggest that you can think about the ayans as part of this devolution, military devolution, and I would suggest that the question of Ottoman decentralization could be explained in the wider context of military devolution and the emergence of the military contractor and military entrepreneur. What you had in the 30 Years' War in Europe. The ions are very similar. Notwithstanding the political risks involved in such a system, it is generally accepted that the contract system was an effective way to overcome limited fiscal, organizational, and administrative capabilities. And this is exactly what the Ottomans have in the 18th century, especially in smaller states. This is not true for the Ottomans, so this contractual system enables states and governments to maintain a military capacity that far exceeded their direct access to resources. And my question is, could it be that the ad hoc measures that eventually led to the fiscal and military devolution in the Ottoman Empire were originally introduced because in the 18th century, Istanbul had to fight rivals, especially Russia, who in comparison to Istanbul had access to much richer human and military resources and thus possessed larger military capacity. Thank you very much.
Did it decline or did it not decline? That is the question. Or is it really? Historians of the Ottoman Empire and the Middle East have been countering the main arguments of the decline paradigm for more than 35 years now. It has been since 15 years that this paradigm was declared an untrue myth. Yet here we are discussing how to counter the main arguments of decline. I'm not suggesting that this panel is unnecessary. Rather, I'm simply admitting that as historians of the Middle East, we seem to have failed to produce a model that would be as attractive to non-specialists as the decline had been. Perhaps, instead of countering the arguments of decline and placing ourselves in a defensive position, like Professor Fall suggested, we should put our own way of, placing a system or suggesting a system. We should acknowledge the recent developments in Middle East and South Asian historiography and shift the discourse from rise and decline narratives that focus on empires and states to socioeconomic and cultural transformations that are centered on societies. Such an approach has two very clear advantages. First, countering the main arguments of the decline paradigm might not be the most persuasive thing to do if we do not at the same time make an effort to shift the center of scholarly attention from, in my case, the Ottoman Empire to Ottoman society. It would be futile to argue that the Ottoman Empire did not decline in its ability to project military power or rule over territories. If there had been a UN Security Council in the 1580s, when William Harborne, the ambassador of Queen Elizabeth, sought the alliance of the Ottomans against the Spanish, the Ottoman Empire would have to be one of its permanent members. By the 1880s, however, things had changed quite a bit. Now Europeans were collecting taxes in the Ottoman Empire in order to directly transfer funds to its creditors. In its international standing, the power of the Ottoman Empire had indeed declined. If we focus on Ottoman society, however, we might both circumvent the decline in the global standing of the Ottoman Empire and have a positive contribution to world historiography in thinking about the non-West in the early modern period as a real player in world history rather than a spectator whose only contribution is limited to its creative adaptations of Western models. As I suggested in my responses to the forum questions, it is possible to narrate early modern Ottoman history as one of social mobility. Thus, rather than engaging with the decline paradigm with a view to refute it as a whole, we should marginalize it by suggesting a different angle to approach the period we study. Since I tackled this very question in my very recently published book, in the remainder of this presentation, I will draw heavily on that study. Taking my inspiration from Rifat Abul-Hajj, Jamal Kafadar, Engin Akarlı, and others, I argue that the Ottoman polity underwent a major socioeconomic transformation in the late 16th and 17th centuries. This transformation is so profound that one would be justified to talk about a second empire that replaced the patrimonial Ottoman Empire, the perfect form of which is so closely associated with the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, from 1520 to 66. This formation that I call the Second Empire came to be marked administratively by an early modern state, as opposed to a medieval dynastic institution, culturally by an early modern sensibility, economically by a relatively more market-oriented economy, legally by a more unified legal system that came to exert some authority over the dynasty, monetarily by a relatively more unified currency system, politically by the development of a type of limited government that grew out of the interaction between the legal developments of the time and such processes as civilization and proto-democratization, and socially by a relatively less stratified society. I use the term proto-democratization to refer to the process at the end of which a much larger segment of the imperial administration came to consist of men who used to be known as outsiders, ajnabi, to the previous ruling elite, whose leadership was dominated by the military slaves of the emperor. Thus, more and more men whose backgrounds were in finance or trade came to occupy significant positions in the government of the empire, replacing those military slaves and civilizing the imperial polity, which I call its civilization. More specifically, I argue that 16th century was marked by the monetization of the Ottoman economy and the political empowerment of socioeconomic groups that benefited from this process, such as merchants and financiers. These changes led to the expansion of the political nation, that is, the body of people who could influence or play a legitimate role in the government. I also focus on the close relationship between socioeconomic changes and the rising political profile of jurists' law, which was based on the Sharia and at times challenged the Qanun, or royally ratified feudal law, directly. I thereby suggest that the empowerment of the Sharia and its interpreters, the jurists or ulama, was not a symptom of decline or fanaticism, but rather an outcome of the expansion of the political nation in a more market-oriented society. The age of the Second Empire is marked by two developments that are closely related to each other but are not the same. One is the expansion of the political nation and the tension that developed between the old elite and the new. And the other one is the reconfiguration of the role of the dynasty within the expanding political nation, which created the two positions that I chose to call absolutist and constitutionalist. Although not a single contemporary Ottoman man or woman might have used the terms absolutist or constitutionalist, it is possible to delineate two distinct political positions in the late 16th and 17th centuries with regard to one's conception of Ottoman royal authority and its limits. One of these positions is based on the idea that public law, that is, the law which defines how the Ottoman polity is supposed to function, recognizes the royal prerogative, a sovereign right subject to no restriction. The second one is built upon the denial of such an indefinite source of authority to the Sultan. I call the former position absolutist and the latter constitutionalist, as it aims at limiting the royal prerogative by strengthening the power of the law. The expansion of the political nation did not place every newcomer to the same sociopolitical space. Some upwardly mobile commoners, for instance, entered the provincial political elite, as so many did in the late 16th century, leading to the well-known Jalali rebellions. Others, however, joined the elite entrenched in the imperial capital, as many others did around the same time, leading to the inflation of numbers in the personnel of the ruling institution. While both of these groups would like to make sure that their privileged status gets confirmed, they may find themselves fighting each other in a struggle in order to obtain that confirmation, as they did in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. In short, thanks to the relative monetization of the Ottoman economy throughout the late 15th and 16th centuries, certain social groups, such as merchants and financiers, built enough capital that they bought their way into the political elite in the late 16th century, and thus led to the expansion of the political nation. It was these new players who disturbed the political domination of the old elite and forced its members to form alliances with them or to take an active stance against them. At the end, the political struggle took place along the boundaries of royal authority between parties that included members of both the old and the new elite. One's place in relation to the political divide between the absolutist and constitutionalist positions was determined by one's answer to the question of who had the authority to articulate the fundamentals of public law, the Sultan or someone else, whether the jurists or a former Sultan who had laid down a constitution for eternity. Those who would benefit from a powerful court pushed for extending the reach of royal authority deep into the domain of public law. Not surprisingly, the absolutist project of the court and its supporters had their discontents who wanted to limit royal authority within certain boundaries, such as those offered by jurists' law. It was the political empowerment of jurists' law and of its most authoritative practitioners, the lords of the law, or the mevali, during the 16th century, that prepared the ground for the increasing intervention of jurists' law into the affairs of the Ottoman dynasty. The socioeconomic transformation of the Ottoman Empire throughout the late 15th and 16th centuries also had an impact on the configuration of political power. The primary object of power in a predominantly feudal society was the domination of agricultural land resources through a chain of military administrators who reached all the way down to the village level in a hierarchical pyramid, at the summit of which stood the monarch. While land did not lose its importance overnight, the gradual development of a market society shifted the primary focus of political power toward the control of monetary resources through a network of patron-client relationships in a web-like structure that did not have a single center. The political actors, whom I call the constitutionalists, would like to place the monarch at the symbolic center of this web, which, not unlike the center of some spider webs, was devoid of any real significance. The absolutists, on the other hand, would rather have the Sultan control the very spinning of the web. Not surprisingly, the Ottoman dynasty responded to attempts at limiting its authority as well as it could. In the past, the dynasty had been successful in transforming the feudal political relations of the formative period between a lord and his vassals into patrimonial relations between the emperor and his slaves. Yet senior slaves of the emperor, such as the viziers, managed to transfer a great deal of political power from the hands of the Sultan to their own, making use of the opportunities offered by a developing market economy. In response, the emperor built a closer circle of power around himself at the court by empowering court officers whose positions had either not previously existed or never had political significance before, such as the chief eunuchs and the chief gardener. A new generation of viziers, who were court creatures rather than autonomous power centers, followed suit. Even though Ottoman absolutism had such viziers at its disposal, it was not able to withstand the growing power of the Janissaries, who had transformed themselves from an elite army into a socio-political corporation that had serious investments in crafts and trade and increasingly large numbers of lower middle to middle class men as members. When the Janissaries learned to form strategic ad hoc alliances with jurists in order to articulate their grievances, they also became able to depose or even murder sultans and enthrone new ones, hence the many depositions of the long 17th century. A sultan's murder at the hands of his slaves clearly marked the opening of a fissure in the continuity between the sultan, his household, and his dominion, the patrimonial empire. The Ottoman Empire of the mid-16th century was the ultimate embodiment of this continuity. The larger polity was imagined as an expansion of the monarch's household. The political structures of the empire that were constructed during the reign of Mehmed II and perfected by Suleiman were based on the principle that the whole empire was the emperor's patrimony and that he was ruling it all personally with the help of his household slaves who were being handpicked by his agents. One of these hand-picked slaves could serve the Sultan's person as his sword bearer at the court and then become the next governor of Egypt, while a lesser page at the palace could graduate as the district governor of a small provincial town. The Sultan was personally in charge of his household, sitting on top of a pyramid-like organization, the power structures of which extended to the rest of the empire. This understanding had grown out of the feudal political practices of the formative period, around 1300 to 1451. The relationship between the suzerain and his vassals had been transformed into that between the patriarch and his slaves. And yet, essentially, the pyramid-like political structure of the empire had not changed from its inception to the late 16th century. In the late 16th century, though, the Sultan started losing his agency in picking his slaves as an increasing number of outsiders, the Ajnabi, had been entering his political organization. Regicides of the 17th century carried his loss one step further. Now, his slaves were picking their own master. The Sultan had lost control in his own household and, by extension, in his empire. Thus, I suggest that the decline narrative might well be replaced by one that focuses on socioeconomic transformation and the development of what Sir James Porter, the British ambassador in Constantinople for 15 years, from 1747 to 1762, called a species of limited monarchy. It is this species of limited monarchy that I call the Second Ottoman Empire. I leave the implications of the fact that the region we came to call the Middle East, which with some modifications corresponds to the lens of the Ottoman Empire, had an indigenous tradition of limited government even before the foundation of the United States, for the audience to discuss. Emphasizing this tradition of limited government should also have obvious advantages in rewriting the history of the Middle East in the wake of the recent developments in the region. Let me conclude with a disclaimer, though. I'm not suggesting that the Ottoman Empire did not decline. I would also not suggest that the decline could be explained simply by the development of an Ottoman authoritarianism in the 19th century in response to European colonialism and the rise of nationalism, even though both of these developments are very important factors in bringing about the end of the Ottoman Empire. Whereas during the Second Empire there was significant progress in many spheres of life, such as the easing or opening of a relatively rigid system of upward mobility in the imperial political structures, and the limitation of royal authority, there were other spheres in which developments were not as positive, such as the military and the production of knowledge. Not surprisingly, the sociopolitical progress in upward mobility and limitation of royal authority on the one hand, and the setbacks in the military and scientific fields on the other were closely related. Some of the ways in which the political nation expanded, by which new social groups came to have an impact on the political process, proved to be hazardous for the military power of the empire. The empowerment of jurists and their law, which contributed to the gradual limitation of royal authority, created unexpected setbacks in the production of scientific knowledge. Some of the expansion of the political nation took place within the ranks of the army, as the Central Infantry Army, that is the Janissary Corps, was transformed into a public corporation representing the interests of certain segments from the middle and lower middle classes. However, this transformation contributed to the territorial losses the Ottoman Empire suffered in the 17th and 18th centuries. The Janissaries were not categorically against the development of a new fighting force that would do the job their predecessors used to do, yet they could see that such a development would eventually bring their privileges and political power to an end. The absolutist ambitions of certain sultans who wanted to get rid of old institutions that had acquired constitutional privileges upset the Janissaries. Thus, the whole question of military reform was a very political question on which hinged the sociopolitical privileges of large masses. The Janissaries defended their political position of opposition to the absolutist designs of sultans and others at the expense of military defeats that cost the Ottomans dearly. At the end, the sultans decided to acknowledge the Janissary Corps as a public corporation and, in effect, granted it almost unlimited autonomy. In consequence, the 18th century was the most peaceful one in terms of political conflicts between the Janissaries and the court, yet at the same time, it was also a century of major territorial losses, contributing to the long-term territorial decline. Not surprisingly, an army centered upon a public corporation of middle and lower middle class merchants and craftsmen failed to perform successfully as a professional military organization. The long-term result of this failure was a weakened military that left the Ottomans vulnerable against the forces of Russian and later Western European imperialism. And here I should add, one could easily add to all of this picture what Professor Agoston said about the ayan and decentralization of power, which is part of the limited monarchy sort of picture that also contributed to the military weakening. A similar fate awaited the ulema, the Ottoman scholars, who became more and more focused on law at the expense of other fields of inquiry. If the Janissaries constituted the physical guardians of the limits of royal authority in the Second Ottoman Empire, the ulema functioned as the socio-political body that safeguarded the intellectual foundations of these limits. Constitutionalist claims aimed at the limitation of royal authority, whether developed by jurists or others, tended to tap into legalistic thought that drew on arguments that more often than not took their claim to truth from tradition, both invented and received. However, some of the earliest absolutist sultans of the period patronized scholars who used arguments based on experiment and reason in their works. As I argued in the article, the offprints of which I was distributing this morning, this patronage should be interpreted as an attempt on the part of the court to destabilize the epistemological supremacy of traditionalist knowledge and thereby take control of the field of jurists' law by reconstituting it primarily on reason rather than tradition. For the constitutionalists, giving away the epistemological ground could lead to giving away their political leverage arising from their monopoly on traditional knowledge, which was the basis of jurists' law. Therefore, the progress of scientific thought slowed down in the Ottoman Empire as most scholars remained suspicious of the absolutist political implications of an epistemology that emphasized reason and experience at the expense of tradition. Each society's future is shaped by a conversation between its past and present. The late medieval past of the Ottoman Empire, which I call the patrimonial empire, had created certain institutions that constituted the legacy inherited and then transformed in the early modern era in the Second Empire. Some of these medieval institutions were so truly transformed in the early modern era that they could not carry out some of their older functions appropriately. The Janissaries, for instance, who quit fighting and became a socio-political corporation that came to represent lower and middle classes of Ottoman society, or the jurist scholars, for instance, who became much more juridical than scholarly in their endeavors to limit royal authority. This does not mean, however, that the Janissaries and the jurists were responsible for the Ottoman decline. If anything, the way in which they transformed their late medieval selves and their relationship with each other, as well as with the dynasty, was truly revolutionary, leading to the proto-democratization of Ottoman political structures and the development of an unwritten constitution about the limits of Ottoman royal authority. In short, the Second Ottoman Empire was moving forward in all senses of the word. It is only when we look backward with a view to understanding its eventual disappearance that we detect structural problems in the relationship between its past and present that weakened it in the long term. Thank you for your attention, and a special thank you to Cemil Aydın, who gave me an opportunity to share my recent work with you all by inviting me here all the way from Davis, California. Thank you.
Again, I'd like to start by thanking the Cemil Aydın, Professor Cemil Aydın, for the kindly inviting me for this forum. I'm a unpretentious legal historian or intellectual historian of late medieval and now is a fashionable turn of the early modern era. I haven't grappled on my own terms what it entails, the late medieval and early modern, but I clearly see, the shifts and the divergences within one particular field. That is the legal and intellectual history. Last 10 years, I've been, more and more focusing on law, in terms of the legal theory, and particularly what I mean by law is the fiqh tradition. That's, you know, I started as an Ottomanist, graduated from the history department. I just, you know, brief the summary of my own the background, and had an opportunity to read some of these texts privately outside the university education. When I came to history department back in late 80s, I had some understanding of these texts and their, you know, the historical, their readings and the transmission throughout the late Ottoman era. But at the same time, I encountered with a new the discourse on the scholarship, which is termed by the Islamic scholar as Islamic law, you know, and within the history curricula, and absolutely there were no rooms for accommodating the type of the material as the subject of the historical inquiry. So when I wanted to do my PhD on the legal history, initial reaction of my the mentors back in Turkey that, are you want to be a historian, or are you changing your topic or changing your field? Are you becoming a theologian or one of those, you know, the professors in the theology schools, whereas we do the history. In the previous topic, I was trying to accommodate between this archival source and also incorporating some of the written the fiqh material into the topic that I was working. So later I came to the US to do the PhD, and I abandoned my the former the topic on the Qada, institution of Qada in 16th and 17th century Ottoman the empire, and boldly went into this the fiqh material. And within the European the context, that's another discourse that, you know, they're quite powerful. That is the discourse of Islamic law. You know, that's the tradition that I happen to know as the fiqh, with various the traditions, the various schools, be it Shiite and Sunni, and within the Sunni, long history and various views. It's all, you know, reduced to the Islamic law. You know, that was quite puzzling. As spoke the morning Professor Necipoğlu, you know, when she was giving the history of the Islamic art, you know, in an essentialist, timeless, and without history. It's very much, you know, the case for the Islamic law, the discourses. You know, so the Islamic law discourse, you know, starts, you know, particularly focus on two concepts, basically. You know, looks at the history of the fiqh through the lenses of two concepts: ijtihad and taqlid, right? You know, the originality or the creative legal reasoning versus the taqlid. Again, without really and much going into the historicity and also theoretical debates within, particularly about this, you know, the two concepts. It's, you know, whether or not, you know, a jurist in a particular time period claims to exercise ijtihad, or whether or not they, you know, they subscribe to the notion of the taqlid. You know, so this is the projecting or the reading the entire legal history just through the lenses of, you know, the two terms, you know, ijtihad and the taqlid. And second is, which is quite the prevalent, is the reading the history of fiqh as a linear narrative, you know, which, you know, somehow originates in Mecca and Medina, and then, you know, goes to the major Islamic cities, the Kufa, Baghdad, and from there on till the 20th century is then just one linear narrative, disregarding the various traditions, scholarly traditions, you know, and also the multifaceted and then the complex the scholarship that has changed over time throughout the Islamic history. And the third, perhaps the problem is not looking at the context at all. You know, a particular legal, you know, the theories and opinions, and when it comes to the furul fiqh, substantive law, that, you know, the particular the idea were held and the nourished, without looking at the context, how this came to be. That is considered, you know, the top position as to, let's say, you know, the Hanafi or Shafi or the many other schools, and without really seeing as an ongoing scholarly the discussions and deliberations and debates within one, you know, the particular the tradition, which has then also the ruptures. It does not follow the one linear the story. That's very much, you know, the approach what I, you know, find in Islamic the law or the Islamic studies, you know, the approach. And when you look at any book, say something in Islamic law, you may, you know, easily find footnotes, you know, referring one to Abu Hanifa and then 19th century Damascene, Ibn Abidin, right? You know, as if nothing has changed, and it's basically this is, you know, the same old the issue. In terms of Ottoman scholarship, when it comes to the fiqh, now we have another the issue that we have to deal with. You know, it is the issue of and particularly the modern the Republican history of the Ottoman past is the dichotomy between the Sharia is a stagnant, unchanging law versus more the rationally grounded and secular Qanun, right? You know, that's the one. But often it's, you know, the total disregard of this sort of the material from the subject of the inquiry at all. You know, the Ottoman legal studies quite often rely on the sigil, the Qadi court, the documents. That's the so far most exploited the sources for the legal history, with the assumption that this is the what happens. That is, you know, what's the law in practice, and whereas this sort of the body of the material is very much frozen and closed the area. So both Islamic studies discourse and Ottoman the historical approach regarding the legal history, particularly the fiqh history of this period, it's the total disregard. Though, you know, this disregard originates from various other concerns. You know, in the Islamic studies context, it's, you know, it's the age of the decline. You know, nothing original, nothing worth the taking into the consideration. And particularly also, I will say that the Professor Kafadar early on mentioned somehow ethnicization of Ottoman law too. You know, in a sense, this is, you know, the Turkish comes into in addition to the Arabic, Turkish comes one of the major languages of the knowledge production in the field of the fiqh, and particularly with regard to the fatwa. That is somehow is then, you know, a vernacular, you know, the vernacular legal scholarship. You know, it may have, you know, a significance for a particular context, but its the larger contribution to the Islamic studies or the fiqh studies is very much marginal. That's, you know, very much the held the notion. what I try to do in my own the studies, looking at the material themselves, all right? You know, reading the legal the text themselves, and also asking the questions as to, you know, who produces these, you know, in what context these the texts were produced, and what were rather the larger institutional and cultural framework within which this body of knowledge produced and reproduced. In the late 14th century, beginning from the late the early 14th century up to the late 16th century, we do have within the Ottoman context is an increase in the madrasa, you know, the institution of madrasa between the 1324, 1580, at least, you know, the area that I focused on, the Western Anatolia and the Balkans. There were more than the 300 the madrasas, you know, the newly established madrasas, you know, they built. You know, it's an enormous number, you know, when you compare to the and medieval the institution that exists in Anatolia and the part of the Memluk Cairo. This is really a significant number. You know, this is a rough number. You know, it could be a more, and I did not include it. You know, the Central, Eastern, and also, you know, the Memluk madrasas within this the number. And along with this, the institutional boom, we also witness, especially in urban areas, the relative increase of the literacy. That is, you know, should be taken into the consideration, this increase of the literacy in the major urban the areas, which has a direct bearings, which I will come later, on the nature of the legal discussions within the Ottoman context. So it's not just limited to the Ottoman realm there. And the third is, and also what sort of scholarly tradition we are talking about when we talk about the Ottoman scholarly tradition. What were some of the ethos and also, you know, the ideals that they were, you know, the aspiring and also claiming to be. You know, in that regard, I see this is not just limited to the fiqh area, but also very much to the other the disciplines of learning, as to the literary studies, you know, the ilm al-balagha, ulum al-lisan in a larger sense, and also the logic and the other disciplines. So one is that this is very much also explored by my colleague Khalid al-Ruwayhib, is the notion of the tahqiq, right? You know, and verification. You know, an ideal and the good scholar is not the one who imitates, but who verifies. You know, what they mean by verification is going through the premises, right? You know, that is, you know, once you receive a proposition, you go through, you examine, and you examine its the proofs, and then come to your own conclusion. May or may not be in conformity with the existing the wisdom. And the second is the Ottoman scholarly world is their competitiveness. You know, this competitiveness has two natures. You know, the competing among themselves, of course, within this, you know, the madrasa system, and then also the taking various positions within the empire. There were a constant the competition for the positions. You know, for the teaching positions and also the legal positions. You know, within this competitiveness and competing for the jobs, and, you know, given the large number of the institution, in Islamic scholarly tradition, the one novelty emerged, and I will, say, and I have not seen in any other the madrasa tradition in Islamic law, the world. That is the introduction of the examination. This examination is not necessarily taking a test at the end of each class or at the end of the semester, but it is of this nature. Once you apply for a particular position, and there were a number of other applicants, and you are given a number of questions to answer those. And also by the coming up by the answering those questions, and also your own inventions, your own take on was very much to look for. It's not just the reiterating the existing the wisdom, but also the giving your own point of view, which by the 17th and 18th century, it's very much institutionalized. This, the examination. We do have the major, the text that how you prepare for the exams in the large the disciplines, right? Again, another issue I would say, there were a number of other, the legal areas that developed outside the fiqh and outside the Qanun. It's very much then the regional phenomena. That's the very much Ottoman engagement with the both, the Safavid and also the various European the countries. These the areas of law that I will mention, and I cannot go into details. That's the maritime law, international law, and then commercial law. The distinct areas of the legal field. The very much emerging, and some is in dialogue with the fiqh literature, but it's very much a development at its own. Without. I don't have much time, but the last I will say the public nature of the Ottoman legal discussions. That is this is the age of legal pamphleteering, what I called, the emergence of Risale writing. Risale as a distinct, the form of legal writing. Of course, I'm not claiming the novelty of the term of Risale. It goes back to the medieval Islamic the intellectual tradition. But the 16th century, the legal treatises has at least the three characteristics. It's argumentative, right? This is, you have a case to prove. And the multivocal, it's not just, your own, you have to prove, the multiple sources, and then footnote, the reference giving. That's then also a quite, the novelty of this, the form of writing. And fourth, it's these are very open texts. They are not the closed the works. This one that I'd like to bring to your attention is a treatise by the Birgili Mehmed Efendi, a 16th century Ottoman scholar who were an ardent critic of the Keshwaf, right? And on the margins, you have the readings of, we don't know. This is an anonymous, the reader, someone, and engaging with text, and the arguing against sometimes, saying, oh, this is an excellent point, or so that's the another field. Well, I should stop here, and thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We now have 20 to 25 minutes of discussion before we break for dinner. So, right back there. Yes, sir.
I have a question for Professor Giancarlo Casale. You have mentioned this global task that are you hearing me?
I got you.
Okay. Yeah, you mentioned this global task that the Ottomans had actually, and the relationship between this Portuguese threat and the consequent response among the Muslim subjects towards a more closer alliance towards the Ottoman masters. To what extent do you believe that the Ottomans actually were aware of this relationship? I mean, to what extent the Indian policy had a way among the, among the preferences of the Ottoman decision makers in the Ottoman grand strategy? Because my concern is that I do a similar type of work when it comes to Mediterranean, and I gather that, I mean, my observations when it comes to Mediterranean as well as the Indian Ocean, to the extent that I just got a glimpse of it, is that both the Himmet registers and the Waqa'anivis, all the contemporary sources, have an imbalanced way of looking at events. For example, if the Hungary or we always, to the extent that the Ottoman Empire has always been depicted as a land empire, the sources, the contemporary sources have also been mentioned these land rivalries more than both the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean ones. So to what extent that the Ottomans were aware of this relationship, and to what extent that did they have a consistent effort to solve the problem of...
Great question. I think one of the big challenges that people who work in Ottoman studies have, especially for earlier periods, is that on the one hand, we have a big advantage over other fields of non-Western history, which is that we have a very rich archive. On the other hand, the archive is limited in some important ways that sometimes don't get acknowledged. There's sort of a fetishism of the archive among Ottoman historians. Oh, archive, 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 archive. And one of the biggest limitations is that the archive only tells you what the Sultan sends out, right? You only have the letters that are getting sent out. You never have the letters that are getting sent back. And my own dissertation research was in the Mughal registers, for example, which is the one that you talked about. Sometimes you have defters and things. In the 16th century, almost nothing except for the Mughal. Those are only the outgoing mail. So I did my research in Lisbon and the archives in Lisbon and in Istanbul. And in Lisbon, you have the letters coming in. And it's really striking how much more information of the kind that you would want to know as a person who's outside trying to figure out what's going on is in those letters coming in rather than the letters that are going out. Because letters that are going out are just sort of projecting some sort of idealized picture of power. And so this was always a problem I wrestled with in my own research, was that these Portuguese reports from the Indian Ocean were giving me really detailed reports about things that the Ottomans were doing. And then I had a lot of difficulty corroborating that when I went to the Muhimmeds. But once you have that other side of the story and you know what to look for, then you start seeing very small pieces of corroboration. So I'll just give you one example because I know we're pressed for time. I had a lot of Portuguese reports about the Ottomans sending delegations to various communities in the Indian Ocean and establishing trade relationships with them in exchange for having the Ottoman Sultan's name read in the khutbah. So I found one Muhimmed document. This was dated from the 1570s, and it was sent from the Ottoman Sultan to the governor of Jeddah. It basically says, "O governor of Jeddah, in olden times," whatever that means, "we had ordered that 100 gold pieces be sent to the 11 mosques in Calicut so that the khutbah would be read in our noble name at the Friday sermon. But it has come to our attention that for the past several years, only 50 gold pieces have been sent to the mosques of Calicut. Please write back to me and tell me the reason why the other 50 gold pieces have not been sent, and make sure that from now on, all 100 gold pieces are sent so that in perpetuity my name will be read in the mosques of Calicut." This is just totally incidentally something that we happen to know because somebody in Jeddah was stealing money. Otherwise we wouldn't know it. But it actually gives us a confirmation. It tells us that there was a mechanism in place to make sure that these guys kept reading the khutbah in the name of the Sultan and paid them to do it. So by kind of piecing all of these things together, we actually can get a relatively rich picture of a policy that is in place and that is actually being actively supported by at least some people who are part of the Ottoman establishment.
Of course, sometimes in the muhimmas, the first part is you have sent a letter in which you ask for this, and then now I order. So you get the incoming, a summary of the incoming information upon which the center acts.
You do, except the problem is that
very short.
Those are more, I mean, those are there so that the person who's getting the letter knows that they're getting the response to the letter that they sent. So, I mean, in one case, I'm sorry to take up time, I'll just say this really fast. In one case, we have a letter from the Sultan of Aceh that was sent to the Ottoman Sultan. And I have a big argument that this actually is not a letter from the Sultan of Aceh, it's a letter that was sent by an Ottoman messenger who went to Aceh, because it's in Turkish, among other things. But it's extremely long. It's about 15 pages long if you do the translation. And we just happen to have it because it's not recorded as a letter from an Ottoman official, it's recorded as a piece of diplomatic correspondence. But then in the Muhime we have the answer, and it's like 2 sentences. So that actually gives us an indication of what these sources would look like if we had them. They would be extremely long and rich and detailed.
Yes, ma'am.
My question is, I was wondering if, as you were looking at these thick documents as multi-voice, multivocal, argumentative, open, is there an awareness in these texts about the way they are being used in courts or court cases? Or do you look at all, or are you looking only at the conceptualization of law, or looking at is there an interaction between that and actual implementation of the law?
That's very much so. These debates, when I mean, the multi-vocal and, and also in the 16th century, in the 15th and 16th century Ottoman, the legal, the world, the production of knowledge when it comes, it's not just one opinion. When you have a particular, you issue a fatwa, and immediately there are a number of others, especially if it's a very controversial issue, responding, challenging you. And many of these treatises, and of course goes through several the stages, at least in the 16th century that I know of, the debate, which originates often from a very pertinent, the relevant legal issue. In 16th century, we do have the cash waqf. In the 15th century, one of the major issues were the slavery, the freedom of the slavery issue, the wela. Once a certain legal deliberation takes place, and there are, the positions held, and then another process, that is the canonization process, in a sense, or the legalization process, and often through the intermediary of the scholar, the Sultan, has some saying, political authority has some saying as to which position to adopt in this particular context, which has its effects on the application and also document protection too. In this Keshwaf controversy in mid-16th century, the endowment deeds, title deeds, before controversy and after controversy is quite the different as to the way they formulate the issues. Yeah, it has.
Yes, sir.
Really, I have one straightforward question, but the answer may not be that straightforward, but I think it's important to ask. In the case of, for Baki Bey, when he referred to these 2 camps debating with each other, it's a very potent debate there, but my straightforward question is, what are their references in terms of the classics of the tradition? Do they bother, both camps, to evoke the classics? Because some of this discussion is very reminiscent of of course, the earlier Mu'tazila, Asharite, and other kinds of debates back in the Abbas, that's Hayrettin Bey's zone. But maybe we can eventually establish some contact between what was happening there. And it's also related, of course, to the taqlid and the ijtihad debate of the late 19th century, early 20th century. But in each case, there are certain classics emerged. This is how you can do the history of a tradition in terms of, I mean, not tradition versus modernity, but as a philosophical term, that thought tradition. What were those references? And there, of course, what would Himmet tell us regarding, I mean, the sources? Does he see something similar to what you observe, I mean, from a different perspective? But I leave it at that. All four talks are very interesting. They, in a sense, deal with Professor Wall's question at the end of the previous panel. We have to ask our own questions, but how in the world do we do that? I mean, it's a good question, but how in the world do we construct those new questions? I have some ideas, but I think already there is an illustration of how we can do it. But then there is this more practical question that
I must admit the question you asked is very significant, but I don't know the answer exactly because I did not study the texts that Himmet is studying, and I would hope that his studies would actually bring up some of those things. I would, what I have found in my own sort of studies are more contemporary references. For instance, for the absolutist case, I argue in an article that I'm working on. I'm looking at a book that Giancarlo very well knows, the new report. And in there, there are references that suggest, you know, the time of the hadith is gone. Now we are in a new time. There's a new hadith, and that is done by observation and experience. So that, for instance, I suggest this is an implied sort of quotient way of pushing a different epistemology. And for the other argument of the, you know, more constitutional anchoring things onto something, I look at a work on China, which is not really about China as much as it is about Ottoman Empire, where the reader is faced with statements such as, in China, the emperors have to really follow the tradition and the law. If they move just one iota away from the tradition, they might be deposed, and then they would be put in a castle. That's how they are so strong. So the kind of evidence I found is more on different literature than the fiqh literature, which I should have studied, but I didn't, I admit. My last name is Tezcan, quick-spirited, impatient, whereas Himmet has the patience and is working through. But I do believe some of the things I said have their sort of reflections. For instance, Sharia, I use the term jurist law to refer to fiqh. And so that fiqh becomes more important and that socioeconomic factors are important is very much there when we look at the cash waqf debate. Cash waqf debate in and of itself is like evidence of how socioeconomic change affects legal structures. And then the evidence I have about sort of the importance of law in politics is more about fatwas and about things in which jurists are sort of consulted. In the early period, we have no references to any fratricide in terms of getting legitimized by a fatwa by consulting the jurist. But from 16th century, from Suleiman's reign on, actually jurists are consulted. And in 17th century, jurists feel strong enough to say, no, you can't do that. So that gives me sort of the confidence to say jurists are now more significant. They actually intervene in political debates in a way that has not happened before in Islamic history. This is something actually, I was very much inspired by a sentence in a book review you wrote about Colin Imber's Abu Suud book. There you were sort of saying, it is, if we look at this simply as the Ottoman state is giving shape to law and law becomes just a sort of tool, political tool, then we are missing the other part of the story, which is the Ottoman state now has to abide by that law. There are certain things that they have to take into account as they are more sort of controlling law and using law for their own legitimacy. In order to be persuasive, they also have to take it seriously and consult the mufti when on such affairs as fratricide, which never was before consulted. So in that sense, I do believe that there is evidence in juristic literature, at least in fatwas. Like in Chronicles, it comes up when the Janissaries go to the muftis or to ulama to ask a question, would it be permissible to follow this sultan? Would, for instance, in 1703 rebellion, would it be permissible to hold Friday prayer under this sultan? So all of these are clearly well-informed references. In an ideal world, I would also like to see references to Mu'tazila and everything. I actually make that connection in the article about science, that this kind of using reason, and this was nothing new. This was not just Ottoman invention. It goes back to an older period where there was this attempt of creating a more absolutist, more sort of political control over law, but it didn't work out then. So here we see Mehmet II sort of trying to do similar things. And I imagine there must be something more than these, and I'm hoping Himmet might see some. You have anything?
Can I add something really quick? I think that there's a very interesting comparative context to study these kinds of questions, because, if you think about kind of the Ottoman case that Baki's laying out, where you have experiments with these kinds of transcendent ideas of state legitimacy that go beyond Islamic law, like being a Roman or being a Mongol or whatever it is. There are all kinds of different experiments. And then the trajectory is kind of towards a more restrictive kind of system based in the Sharia. You really can see that very similar trajectory in different ways in the Safavid case and in the Mughal case. You're going from Akbar to Aurangzeb, came up earlier, or Shah Ismail to, the Shah Abbas. These are something that's happening beyond just the Ottoman context, and it could be something to explore in a comparative context.
Thank you. This was a wonderful panel. Thank you so much. A quick question for Giancarlo, and then a question for Professor Agoston. Giancarlo, that final slide, which is absolutely stunning, it reminded me very much of Queen Elizabeth, the painting Queen Elizabeth standing over her realm, which is a huge painting, the biggest. Is there a connection, or is this kind of convention? Just quickly, the question for Professor Agoston is, in terms of North Africa and the early modern period, in the 17th century, as basically French and British fleets begin to take over the Western Mediterranean as a result of their superior naval technology, the one kind of form of artillery that has been constantly, and actually cited in the French sources and then the British sources, is the development of the long-range mortar, which somehow nobody in the Regencies, as far even as Alexandria, somehow was able to imitate or do the same, which, as a result of which, basically the British and the French could bomb anything they want and would be completely unharmed. Is there any reason why they couldn't develop something like that? You said that they could develop these huge cannons, and of course they're still even there, you can go and see them, but the mortars, which seem to have been by far more effective, were not. So I'm very curious about that.
The Ottomans had mortars on land, and it might relate to the fact that the galley cannot accommodate, it has very limited capability. There is no broadside artillery on Ottoman ships because the galley is just not good for that. So I would say that this might be that. The Ottomans had mortars, and I made a comparison from the 15th century on between European mortars used on land in sieges, and they were very good, and they were comparable to the Habsburg mortars and other mortars. I don't know the specific example, but I speculate that it has to do with the nature of the ship. because these are new type. These, I assume that these are ship of the line.
Yeah.
So they have broadside. You know, in a galley you have one centerpiece and you have two flanking, or maybe two on both sides, and that's also not more than 4. Whereas these ship of the line have 40, 76. You know, Colin Haywood has a very interesting article, and the Ottomans started to use it from the 18th century on, influenced by the French, and Daniel Panzak has an interesting article which enumerates, based on French sources, the different cannon, and these were comparable, but again, this is only after they have ship of the line.
I mean, they had long-range cannon on the ships. I mean, because...
Can we move on to another question?
Sorry, okay. I'll talk to you later.
Because we're almost out of time.
There is a second part to the question.
Giancarlo didn't answer.
There's definitely a connection, but it's got to be explored more.
We'll take one question here, and then Lino Hassani.
Thank you very much. Very interesting to hear about the legal debates over the legitimacy of rule in the Ottoman period, but the Safavids had exactly the same sort of problem. That the context of it was different. The Shi'i-ness is distinctive, but nevertheless there were many debates over whether the Safavid Shahs had the kind of authority that they were claiming, both directly and indirectly, not only in the 15th, 16th century, but also the 17th century. And some of this involved Friday prayer as well. So it seems to me if the world historians are listening, there is a questioning here and a dynamic of vitality in fiqh that is not usually conceived of. It's usually perceived as pretty dry, dull stuff, but some of it's actually pretty cool. And this is that kind of discussion here where there's clerics who are not 100% sure here and are willing to go to the line to say, no, we don't think this is the right thing to do. It's not monolithic, in other words. So thank you very much.
The part of the also assumption of the fiqh discipline that, you know, as soon, once there is an opinion that is not based upon the strong textual the evidences, that is open for debate. There is no certainty over there. This, you know, the concept that's used in mujtahid fiqh, that is, you know, the subject to the ijtihad, is not an area of the certainty. So this is the epistemological, you know, the ground that, you know, that allows them to, you know, the maneuver within this large body of the legal material and also come up with, you know, the multiple solutions.
Yep.
You know.
Yep.
Yeah, my question relates to the one earlier, actually. Almost was getting my answer, but I think there is a bit that needs a bit of clarification. And that relates to my interest again in history of technology and engineering. I admire, and that's something to do with my question is to do with how does the Sultan make a decision, and should we blame him or blame the religious fuqaha around him for them. Two incidents that come to my mind in that strand of history. One is the brilliant work of Taqiyuddin ibn Ma'ruf al-Rasid, who to me was a great hero because not of the observatory that he built and then the Sultan somehow destroyed it, but because he has developed a brilliant 6-cylinder engine, which is almost like the cars that we have today in the year 1550, and also developed a weight-driven clock as against all the previous clocks, which were water clocks. Now, whom do we blame for the destruction of his observatory, the Sultan or the religious people around the Sultan? That's one question. The other one is who to praise for Sultan Abdul Majid's decree. One of the farmans has said that all load-carrying animals must have 1 day holiday in the week. Is that a religious influence, or is it just a political or getting some sort of sympathy? I don't think he will get any votes from the animals, but I really would like to know how does the Sultan make his decision? Because that tells us whether in fact this was something to do with the religious process of thought, or was it just, you know, his own whims?
The second one, of course, is in the Bible.
Sorry?
The one about a day of rest for the animals is in the Bible.
Was it? Right.
Yes,
So
Sabbath observance required.
So does that But how does the Sultan, you mean, are you saying that he actually learned it from the Bible? Or has he learned it from, where did those religious fiqh fits in both occasions?
Something on the go ahead.
So these two occasions are very interesting.
As far as I know, in the 1580 destruction of the observatory, there was a fatwa issued by the Mufti of the time. The question is, shall we take that fatwa and then say the scholars of Islam, jurists, they were just against science? Or shall we take it and then try to sort of contextualize and interpret it in a larger setting in which I'm suggesting, which is, the matter is not necessarily just science. There are other things that are related to it in terms of which epistemology is more important. That is the way I look at it. That is why I'm suggesting it is not simply a matter of religious conservatism against new knowledge. It is more like Murad III has a number of projects that do suggest sort of patronizing a certain type of science, perhaps at the expense of different inquiries, such as more based on tradition, which would have been detrimental to the position of traditional knowledge and epistemology of law. So that is why I think the jurists were against such things as the observatory that were receiving imperial patronage. And the patronage actually has clear references to the Mongol past, how strong kings have big observatories and how that brings great power. It's only the greatest kings who have such power to build such observatories. So he does have this language in his fermans about the observatory. So as a result, I can imagine the jurists getting, okay, where is he going with this? Perhaps he's going to move, and because he does other things. He takes things like, he takes care, fires a mufti and appoints another one and changes their time, sort of, rather than letting them rule for many years, he starts sort of like hiring and firing muftis. So I think there is something about limitation of his authority versus the law that is going on, and so the Imperial Observatory as a result gets into that debate as a potential thing that would have strengthened the Sultan. So in short, yes, it is, I think, the Mufti who is perhaps responsible, but putting it that way creates a very wrong one-sentence answer that I would rather not do. We should look at it in the larger context.
If I could just add, I think one way to understand this is the way I understand these things, is that in that period, there's actually a big fight going on between one faction of people that you could ascribe as the Kuls. These are people who are actually mostly first-generation Muslims, converts, people who have migrated from Europe. And then there are Mirdumzades. These are people who are from old Muslim families who have been educated in madrasas, and they're competing for the resources of the state. And one of the ways that this battle gets played out is what kind of knowledge is the best kind of knowledge. And you can see it in something like an observatory, but I see it a lot because I study maps. I see it a lot in maps. There are all of these people that are drawing European-style maps, but then you have a lot of people who are making these syntheses of the Arabic classics of geography. There's a very interesting passage in Sayyidi Ali Rais's treatise on navigation in the Indian Ocean, in which he describes the principles of cartography. And he says, there are two ways of making maps. One is called Papamundi, and the other one is called Harita. And then he gives an etymology. He says, Papamundi, Harita is the classical way of making maps that shows, it's called Harita because it comes from quarta. This is not right, but it doesn't matter, which means quarter. And it's so called because it shows the inhabited quarter of the world that was once corresponded with the realm of Alexander the Great. So in other words, it's a surat al-arz, it's the kind of map that a Muslim geographer would make. Whereas a Papamundi is a map that shows the entire world, so it's a European-style map. And it's so called because Papa is the greatest of the Christians, and Mundi means the entire world. So, in other words, what he's saying is if you draw the world according to a European-style map, you're actually buying into all kinds of claims to sovereignty that are specifically Christian, and therefore they're incommensurate with Ottomanness. So the appropriate...
It doesn't tally with our understanding of the cartography and maps.
Yeah. So the point is that in this... Right. And the point is it's this particular configuration of knowledge in this particular political environment where people are fighting about things and people have valences that are specific to that environment, that then this discourse of, well, this is Islamic and this isn't, becomes activate. That's the way that I would understand this question.
No, no.
There's an interesting precedent about the destruction of observatory. Will be
We have wonderful material to discuss over dinner.